All right, class, welcome to week 3 of your human biology lab. So we're in lab 3, which is cells and tissues. And just a reminder that this cell and tissue worksheet will be due Sunday, September 12th at midnight. But like usual, you have the lab 2 quiz. So you'll have your microscopy quiz also due this Sunday. So again, every Sunday you'll have a lab worksheet due for that week, as well as a quiz due on the lab from the previous week. And the quizzes will be using Proctorio, so they'll be remotely proctored. For the lab worksheets, I'm leaving it a little more open-ended because there was some confusion about groups who had turned it in if their person wasn't a part of that group. So when you submit your worksheet, even if you're working together in your lab group, and feel free to do so, just please submit it individually. So even if you're all working on one document, just make sure everyone has a copy of that document and they're all uploading that document. And make sure that your names are all on that group worksheet as well. And again, if you have a person in your group who's not working, or you're doing a lot of work yourself, just start working by yourself or don't put their name on top of the worksheet. So I haven't had any problems yet. And I think a lot of you are working together, which is good. So this week we have cells and tissues. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the lab guide. So like usual, I think the lab guides are very well organized so that you can kind of work through the lab guide and the worksheet at the same time. I'll take you through some of them together, but per usual, I'll let you guys kind of work through a little bit on your own. So for the first activity, you'll be identifying different cell structures, and they'll be illustrated in the cell. You can use your lecture textbook, any sort of lecture videos that you might be going over cell structures. I think by now you've probably gone over like mitochondria, nucleus, everything, parts of the cell. There's also an interactive tutorial that allows you to click on the parts of the cell to identify them and their structures. This is a great tutorial. You'll want to click on the cell model, probably the plant or the animal. Here's a short YouTube tutorial for cell structures and their functions. So you'll kind of work your way through that. And then I'm going to pull up your worksheet. So here's a look at the worksheet that you'll be going through. Again, I'm pretty sure you guys have had this in lecture already. Cells are the basic units of life, as you know. Cells can be prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And the difference is that prokaryotic are more simple cells. They do not have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. And the eukaryotic cells are the more complex cells. And that's what makes up humans, which is what you're taking a course on, human biology. Human cells are eukaryotic and they focus, so we're going to focus majority of the time on the eukaryotic cells, and we'll be looking at all of the organelles within a eukaryotic cell. So you will have to identify the different organelles within a eukaryotic cell. We have a nucleus, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, mitochondria, centrosomes. Each organelle within the cell has its own function. So for example, mitochondria create ATP that the cell needs. The nucleus is kind of like your cell's brain that kind of directs all other activity. Golgi apparatus works to take in proteins and then ship them off in the appropriate place where they'll be going. Centrosomes help with dividing of the cell. So again, can you just give me a thumbs up or maybe write in the chat if you have been over this in lecture yet? I'm kind of making an assumption that you have, but I just want to make sure that you have a little bit idea of this. So for activity 1, those links that I just showed you in the lab guide, they will give you different tutorials that will help you identify the different structures of the cell. So you'll want to go through those tutorials, watch that YouTube video to identify the different parts of the cell, and then you'll type in the organelles below here. So for example, number 2 is pointing at the nucleus, and number 1 is pointing at the nucleolus, which is inside the nucleus. And you'll see other structures labeled here. And I'll let you guys kind of work through a little bit of kind of labeling the cell structures on your own. But again, if you have questions on this, some of it might be a little confusing. 10, 12, and 4 all look really similar, but there's different shapes and sizes to them. So try to figure that out on your own. But if you have a question on it, send me a message and I'll definitely help with that as well. So that's kind of the first activity. The second activity is just to describe the function of each of the organelles. So you worked on labeling and identifying the different organelles in a eukaryotic cell. And then activity 2 has you typing in the specific job or function of each of those organelle or cell structures. And for activity 2, you can use your textbook to help a little bit with that. The tutorial in activity 1 will also be helpful because as you're identifying, using these tutorial links, they'll also tell you the job or function. So that's activity 2. Activity 3 is looking at a plant and animal cell structure. We'll be looking at a short demonstration of preparing a cheek cell wet mount. So if we were in lab together, we'd be using these materials to kind of take a toothpick to slough off some cells on the inside of your cheek to create your own wet mount slide to look at your own cheek cells underneath a microscope. So these are kind of the instructions for doing that. And then I think what we include for you is just a sample cheek mount slide. So looking at some cheek cells, not of your own, but of the instructor who created this lab manual. And then you'll need to answer some questions as you're looking at this sample cheek mount slide of the cheek cells. Keep in mind that it's telling you the magnification right here. So you're looking at these cells at 400 times magnified. I'm going to go through your worksheet just to see what else we have to do for this part for activity 3. So again, activity 2 takes you through listing all the job and functions of the organelles. And here's activity 3. I think you'll have to draw the example that we give you of the cheek cells. Don't forget to put a title and the magnification. Describe the shapes of the cells. Some of the cells may be folded or wrinkled. And what does this indicate to you about the thickness of the cells? So you'll notice in the sample view of the cheek cells, some of them look folded or wrinkled. And what does that tell you of the thickness of these cells? Probably, do you think they're really thin or really thick cells if they can be easily folded and kind of crumpled? Keep in mind they're on the inside of your cheek, so they're a type of skin cell. So they'll be incredibly thin if they can kind of fold and get crumpled up. So here are 2 kind of examples. You can draw it at 400 or 600 times magnified. The second part of activity 3 is looking at a plant cell. And you can look at the short demonstration to look at how we would make a slide or a wet mount slide of plant cells to look at those underneath the microscope. And then we'll give you an example of what plant cells look like underneath the microscope at 600 times magnified. And again, looking back at your worksheet, you'll take you through what we'll be doing. And then I believe you'll have to make a drawing of the plant cell. Don't forget to put a title, which would just be Elodia. And then the total magnification here, describe the shape of the cells. And then you'll want to explain how these cells differ from the animal cheek cells you previously viewed. And you should see a lot of differences between the plant cell as shown here and the cheek cell as shown up here. So just describe any sort of differences you've seen between the cheek cell and the plant cell. And then the rest of kind of the activity takes you through different tissues. And tissues are specialized cells that come together to form a tissue in the body. And different tissues have different names. So for example, the tissues can be named for the number of layers that are in the tissue. So if a tissue is a simple epithelium, it will just have 1 layer of cells. And if it's a stratified, it will have more than 1 layer. They're also named for the cell shape. So squamous are nice flat cells. So this is an example of a simple squamous epithelium. We have adipose tissue, an example of what adipose tissue would look like underneath a microscope. We have a picture of what blood would look like underneath a microscope. The red cells, the white blood cells are shown as seen as staining a little bit darker. And then the platelets are the teeny tiny kind of dots. So this is what blood tissue looks like underneath the microscope. This is what bone tissue looks like underneath the microscope. Here's an example of cartilage tissue underneath the microscope. So in terms of your worksheet, what you'll be doing here is you will be describing the general functions of each of these tissue types, and then just making your own drawing or illustrating. If you are having problems drawing on these worksheets or printing off and then scanning or uploading them, I will accept an illustration of a different picture of these same tissue types. So you're going to want to write the general function, and then a drawing is ideal. But if you can't make a drawing, please upload another picture. And you'll be going through different muscle tissue types as well. So I'm going to take us back to kind of the lab guide. So you'll go through, this is what skeletal muscle looks like underneath the microscope, and then cardiac muscle. Here's actually a reminder of how to insert images of illustrations once they're drawn. But again, if you're having problems with that, I will also accept other pictures. So that takes you through different tissues in the body and what they look like underneath a microscope. And your worksheet will again have you taking through the general function of each tissue and then a drawing. And then there's a couple questions at the end. And we'll go over them right now in case you haven't been over this a lot in lecture. What type of control does skeletal muscle tissue exhibit? And what that is referring to is the control involuntary or voluntary. So what that means is over your skeletal muscles, which are the muscles that are connected to your bones, can you voluntarily control them, or are they involuntarily moving without you contracting? Can I get some sort of answer in the chat? What do you guys think? Are skeletal muscles under voluntary control or involuntary control? What do you guys think? Thanks, Yvonne. So yeah, your skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. So that's the answer to number one. And that just means that you guys are controlling when your skeletal muscles are contracting. Number two, then, what type of control does cardiac muscle tissue exhibit? So in the chat, what do you guys think? Your cardiac muscle tissue is in the walls of your heart. Is that something you guys control, voluntary, or do your cardiac muscle cells contract without you knowing it? You're right. So number two would be involuntary, meaning they will contract automatically on their own. Good. Which tissue type was not observed using the prepared microscope slides in this activity? So there's 4 tissue types in the body. There's epithelial tissue, there's connective tissue, and then there's muscle tissue. The 4th main group of tissues in the body, does anyone know what it is that we did not go over? And if you don't know, it's okay. But out of the 4 tissue types in the body, we went over 3 of them right now. We went over epithelial, connective tissue, muscle tissue. The 4th is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue makes up kind of the 4th major group of tissue in the body. And that's the one that we didn't really go over. And that's because it's really hard to find a good microscopic image of nervous tissue. So number 3, the answer to number 3 is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue makes up all of your nerves, your brain, and your spinal cord. And then identify the function of the tissue category you named in number 3. And that's a question that I will let you guys do on your own. So number 3, the category that we did not go over in this lab is nervous tissue. And for number 4, I want you guys to identify the function of nervous tissue. So what that does in the body. That kind of brings us through a really brief introduction to this lab. But again, you'll spend time working through the tutorials on the cell to help you label the cell and then describe all of the jobs and functions of each of the organelle, each of the cell types. Then you will go through and work through the plant and animal cell structures that the lab guide takes you through. And then you'll go over kind of identifying these different tissue types in the different pictures. In terms of your lab quiz for this lab, I'll probably include pictures like this on your lab quiz that you have to identify. So you'll have to know what cardiac muscle looks like, what skeletal muscle looks like, cartilage, bone, adipose, blood, as well as probably identifying a couple of the organelles in a cell. So spend some time making sure you can identify the different organelles in the cell, as well as identifying the different tissue types of the cell as well. If you just joined us late, I'll post this recording probably in an hour if you want to catch the first half of it. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and answer any extra questions that you guys have come for me right now.